I never imagined my life would take such a dramatic turn. Reflecting on it now, I can hardly believe it all happened to me. For years, I struggled to rebuild myself, and even today, there are moments when the weight of those memories threatens to pull me under. It all began a few weeks before that life-changing day. Emily and I had been married for 10 years. I was 36, and she was 34. For the majority of our marriage, I thought we had something solid, something unshakable. We had 2 wonderful children, a 6-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter. Life wasn't perfect, but I genuinely believed we were happy, or at least, I thought she was. Recently, though, a strange tension had crept into our lives. Emily had become distant, cold, and overly critical. She wasn't the warm, supportive woman I'd once fallen in love with. Instead, she seemed to constantly find faults, particularly in my income. She'd point out how it was enough to cover the basics but never the extras she wanted. Yet, despite my encouragement, Emily refused to work, even part-time. Whenever I cautiously suggested it, her response was cutting. "A real man provides for his family, Daniel. If I wanted to work, I wouldn't have married someone like you." That stung, but what came next cut even deeper. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the wrong choice having kids with you," she said one evening, her voice laced with resentment. Those words stunned me. I couldn't reconcile the person in front of me with the Emily I had built my life with. Her growing bitterness seeped into every aspect of our home. Emily began to make snide remarks about me in front of the kids, things like, "Daddy can't afford it," or "Daddy's too tired to help." I would come home from long days at work only to find the house in disarray and dinner unmade. Despite not contributing financially or domestically, I was somehow always the one failing. In a desperate attempt to salvage our crumbling marriage, I took on a second job. I thought that if I made more money, she might soften toward me, maybe even see me in a new light. Working night shifts on top of my day job was grueling. My body ached constantly, and I was always teetering on the edge of exhaustion. But I convinced myself it was worth it. It wasn't. Emily remained as distant and critical as ever. The extra income one brought in didn't seem to make a difference. Instead, it became another weapon for her to wield against me. "Now you're never home," she'd say, glaring. "What kind of father are you?" No matter what I did, I felt like I was losing. Then came the accident. I remember that night clearly. It was late October, and the crisp air of Portland, Oregon, carried a chill that hinted at the approaching winter. I had just finished my day's shift and grabbed a quick meal before heading to my second job at a warehouse across town. As I crossed Pioneer Boulevard, my thoughts were consumed with the never-ending bills piling up at home. I didn't see the truck until it was too late. The driver, whether distracted or careless, I'll never know, plowed through the crosswalk. There was a screech of tires, a blinding pain, and then, nothing. When I regained consciousness, I was in a sterile hospital room. The antiseptic smell was overwhelming, and the rhythmic beeping of machines filled the air. My body felt heavy, weighed down by casts and a dull, unrelenting ache. The doctor arrived soon after. He didn't mince words. I was lucky to be alive, but my lower body was paralyzed. There was hope for recovery, but no guarantees. For the foreseeable future, walking was off the table. It felt like the world had crumbled beneath me, but I told myself I could get through it. After all, I had Emily and our kids. Surely, they would stand by me, and together, we'd find a way forward. Or so I thought. Emily visited me a few hours after the doctor left. I had been staring at the ceiling, replaying his words in my mind, when I heard her voice. At first, I felt relief. My wife, my partner, had come to see me. But that feeling didn't last long. Something was off. Her tone was detached, her body language cold, as though she were visiting a distant acquaintance instead of her husband. She sat by my bedside for about 20 minutes, saying all the right things, but there was no genuine warmth behind her words. "You're alive, and that's what matters," she said, barely glancing at me. I waited, hoping for more, for comfort, for a sign of the love we once shared. But nothing came. "Maybe you could bring the kids next time," I suggested, trying to sound hopeful. "I'd love to see them." Her response hit me like a punch to the gut. "They don't want to see you like this, Daniel," she replied flatly. Before I could process her words, she stood up, brushed imaginary lint off her blouse, and said, "I have things to take care of." And just like that, she was gone. Her visits became a pattern, brief, emotionless, and increasingly infrequent. She'd sit with me for a few minutes, mutter some platitudes, and leave with an excuse about errands or appointments. She never brought flowers, snacks, or even a kind word to lift my spirits. Eventually, the sarcasm began to creep in. "I guess I'll have to do everything now," she snapped one day after I asked her to adjust my pillow. "Don't get used to this." Weeks went by, and I hadn't seen my kids. Then, one day, Emily finally brought them along for a visit. My heart leapt at the sight of them. My daughter, Madison, was now 9, and my son, Ethan, was 7. Their shy smiles reminded me of better times. Emily, however, didn't stay. She dropped them off with a curt, "I'll be back in a couple of hours," and left without so much as a backward glance. That was fine by me. I was desperate for time alone with my children. I tried to keep things light, cracking jokes and telling them stories. But Madison, sharp as ever, sensed something was wrong. "Daddy," she asked, her big brown eyes full of concern, "are you going to be okay?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "This is just temporary. Soon, I'll be running and playing with you again." She seemed reassured, but then her next words sent a chill through me. "Why does Grandpa come to the house when you're not there?" I blinked, confused. "Grandpa?" I asked. "Not real Grandpa," Ethan chimed in. "The man who brings Mommy flowers." Madison nodded. "He's there a lot," she said. "They talk in your room, and then they lock the door." I felt my stomach turn. My kids, so innocent, had no idea of the weight their words carried. But I did. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with questions and anger. Who was this man? How long had he been in my house? In my bed? The next day, Emily showed up with a stack of papers and dropped them unceremoniously onto the table by my hospital bed. "I'm filing for divorce," she said, her tone as casual as if she were announcing a dinner reservation. I stared at her in disbelief. Before I could speak, she added, "I'm still young, Daniel. I can't waste my life like this. You're not the same man I married, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life as your nurse." Her words pierced deeper than anything I'd ever felt. She wasn't just leaving me, she was dismantling our family, tearing apart everything we had built. I didn't say anything. What could I say? 3 months later, I saw Emily again, this time in the courtroom. By then, I had been discharged from the hospital and confined to a wheelchair. Seeing her walk into the room, polished and unapologetic, made my blood boil. She was accompanied by a high-powered attorney, the kind that only people with deep pockets could afford. Life had taken a nosedive for me. What little savings I had left after paying off hospital bills and covering basic expenses was quickly drained by physical therapy and medication costs. I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I had no choice but to represent myself. The divorce trial was brutal. Emily's lawyer painted a damning picture of me, claiming I had been an inattentive husband and father even before the accident. He argued that I was financially incapable of supporting my children and emotionally unfit to care for them. I wanted to scream the truth, that I had taken on a second job to try to please her, that I had given everything I could for our family, but my words felt feeble against the carefully crafted narrative her lawyer presented. The verdict was devastating. Full custody of Madison and Ethan was awarded to Emily. The only small relief was that the court didn't order me to pay child support. My financial situation was already dire. Still, the loss of my children felt like the final nail in the coffin. Not long after, I had to face another court battle, this time against the logistics company whose truck had nearly ended my life. I thought I had a strong case. After all, I had been crossing the street at a designated crosswalk when the driver hit me. But the company's legal team was formidable. They presented manipulated footage and brought in questionable witnesses to claim I was distracted and reckless. They painted me as the one at fault, and I had no lawyer to challenge their narrative effectively. The result? No compensation. I was left with nothing, a disabled man without a family, without a job, and without hope. With nowhere else to turn, I moved back in with my mother. She was in her late 60s and still running the small flower shop my father had started before he passed away. Despite her modest means, she welcomed me home with open arms. It would have been easy to give up. The betrayal, the humiliation, the loss, it all weighed on me like a ton of bricks. I spent many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd fallen so far. But even in my darkest moments, I refused to let go of one thing: my children. I started helping my mother with the flower shop. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, but soon, I realized the business had potential. I threw myself into researching trends, modernizing the shop, and connecting with new suppliers. I also began attending intensive physical therapy sessions, determined to regain my mobility. It wasn't easy. The pain was constant, and progress was slow, but I refused to give up. Over time, things began to improve. A year later, I was walking again, albeit with a limp, and managing the flower shop full-time. That's when I met Lauren. Lauren owned a flower distribution business, and we crossed paths at a local vendor expo. She was in her late 30s, confident, and full of warmth. What started as a professional connection quickly turned into a friendship, and before long, it became something more. Lauren had a 5-year-old daughter, Sophie, from a previous marriage. She was bright, curious, and reminded me so much of Madison. Being around Lauren and Sophie filled a void I hadn't realized was so deep. A year into our relationship, Lauren and I got married. Suddenly, I had a new family, my wife, my stepdaughter, and my mother. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it was full of love and hope. With Lauren's business expertise, the flower shop flourished. We expanded our services, added wedding arrangements and event decor, and became a cornerstone of the local community. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of stability. But even as my new life took shape, the ache for my children never went away. When I finally had the financial resources, I decided to fight for my right to see my children. I hired a top-notch attorney and took Emily back to court. This time, things were different. I was no longer the man she could paint as a helpless victim. I was stable, successful, and determined. My lawyer built a compelling case, showing that I had rebuilt my life and that I had a strong desire to be a part of Madison and Ethan's lives. The court didn't grant me full custody, but I was awarded visitation rights, 15 days every 3 months. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Considering Emily had moved with the kids to Seattle, Washington, it was a logistical challenge, but I didn't care. I would have traveled across the world to see them. The day of our first visit, I was a bundle of nerves. It had been years since I'd seen Madison and Ethan, and I wasn't sure how they'd react. When they arrived, they were shy at first, almost reserved. Ethan clung to Madison, who avoided eye contact and gave me short, polite answers to my questions. They were distant, and I couldn't blame them. When Lauren and Sophie joined us in the living room, the kids' surprise was evident. Madison stared at Lauren, her eyes wide with confusion, and whispered to Ethan, who nodded solemnly. Later that evening, when we were alone, Madison finally asked, "Daddy, who is she? I knelt down to her level and said, her name is Lauren. She's my wife now, and Sophie is her daughter. They're part of our family, but that doesn't change how much I love you and Ethan. She nodded but didn't say much. It was clear she had questions, but something held her back. The next morning, over breakfast, the truth came out. Madison looked up from her cereal and said, Mom said you don't love us anymore. She said you left us to start a new family. My heart sank. For years, Emily had been feeding them lies, painting me as the villain. That's not true, sweetheart, I said gently. I never stopped loving you or Ethan. I fought hard to see you again, and I'll keep fighting to be part of your lives. That's a promise. They both cried, and I held them close. For the first time in years, it felt like the walls Emily had built between us were starting to come down. The rest of the visit was magical. We went to the park, played board games, and stayed up late watching movies. By the time they left, they were already asking when they could come back. But amidst the joy, they revealed something that broke my heart. Mom's husband doesn't like us, Ethan said quietly as we packed their bags. He doesn't talk to us, Madison added. And he gets mad when we play too loud. I promised them that I would do everything in my power to bring them home for good. With renewed determination, I threw myself into another battle, the case against the logistics company. This time, I wasn't alone. I had a skilled legal team, a stronger understanding of my rights, and new evidence that clearly showed the driver's negligence. The trial was tense, but I stood my ground. Finally, justice was served. The court awarded me a substantial settlement, including punitive damages for the company's mishandling of the original case. The compensation was more than I had hoped for, enough to secure my family's future and give me the resources to continue fighting for custody of my kids. When I told Madison and Ethan about the court victory, they were thrilled. Ethan hugged me tightly and said, "Now you can really bring us home, right, Dad?" Those words lit a fire in me. Around this time, I started hearing rumors about Emily's situation. Despite years of living with her wealthy partner, she had never managed to secure the marriage she'd likely been hoping for. According to mutual acquaintances, he refused to marry her, citing concerns about dividing his assets. The irony wasn't lost on me. Emily had abandoned our family for a man who saw her as nothing more than a temporary indulgence. But what happened next was completely unexpected. One afternoon, I was in my office, finalizing plans for a new flower shop location, when the door burst open. My assistant followed close behind, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Harris," I tried to stop her, but I waved her off, my heart sinking as I looked up. There stood Emily, disheveled and frantic, her eyes darting around the room. "What are you doing here?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she began pacing, wringing her hands like a woman on the verge of a breakdown. Finally, she stopped and blurted out, "I made a mistake, Daniel. I shouldn't have left you. I thought I was doing the right thing, but he doesn't love me. He never did. And now I'm all alone." Her words hung in the air, but I felt no sympathy. "You made your choices, Emily," I said, my voice calm but firm. "And I've moved on. I have a family now, one that loves me and supports me. You don't belong here." She broke down, pleading with me to give her another chance. But there was no going back. Emily's breakdown in my office was surreal. She had spent years tearing me down, abandoning our family, and building a life with someone else, only to come crawling back when it all fell apart. But I wasn't the same person she had walked away from. "Emily," I said, standing up and walking toward her slowly, "whatever you're looking for, it's not here. I've built a new life, and I won't let you destroy it." Her pleading turned to anger. "You think you're better off without me?" she shouted. "You wouldn't have survived without me all those years." I shook my head, a calm resolve washing over me. I've not only survived, Emily, I've thrived. You made your choices. Now, you'll have to live with them. Before she could say more, I buzzed for security. Watching her be escorted out of my office was the closure I didn't realize I needed. But Emily's visit only strengthened my resolve to fight for full custody of Madison and Ethan. The next time we were in court, I was ready. With the help of my lawyer, I presented evidence of Emily's instability and neglect, as well as testimony from my children about their difficult life with their mother and stepfather. Emily's lawyer tried to dismiss my claims, but the evidence spoke for itself. My settlement from the logistics company had allowed me to provide a stable, loving home, and the judge took notice. This time, the court ruled in my favor. Full custody of Madison and Ethan was awarded to me, and Emily was granted limited visitation rights. Bringing my children home was one of the happiest days of my life. When they walked into the house, Madison and Ethan looked around in awe. Lauren and Sophie had decorated their rooms with posters, toys, and bedding they knew the kids would love. My mom had cooked a feast, and we all sat down together for dinner, a family united at last. Over time, Madison and Ethan began to heal. They bonded with Lauren and Sophie, and our blended family grew stronger with each passing day. The flower shop business continued to thrive, and we even opened a second location in Seattle. One weekend, while hiking with the kids, Ethan stopped and tugged on my sleeve. "Dad," he said, looking up at me with bright eyes, "I'm glad we're home." It was a simple statement, but it meant everything. As for Emily, she faded into the background of our lives. From what I heard, her wealthy ex-boyfriend cut ties with her entirely, leaving her to pick up the pieces on her own. I didn't feel anger anymore, just pity. Today, life is better than I ever imagined. My business is thriving, my family is whole, and the pain of the past feels like a distant memory. Every night, as I tuck Madison and Ethan into bed, I remind them how much I love them and how grateful I am that we found our way back to each other. Sometimes, life tears you apart so it can rebuild you into something stronger. I am living proof of that.